My father's final gift was the evidence to jail my brother. I always thought the worst part of losing my father would be the silence that fell over his workshop. But the true burden of his death arrived a year later, disguised as a gift and containing the one secret I never wanted to know. It was the proof of my brother's betrayal, and the beginning of his end. The air in the workshop still held the ghost of his father. It was a layered scent of cedar shavings, mineral oil, and the faint, sharp tang of ozone from the old belt sander. For a year, Leo had left the space untouched, a perfect time capsule of Arthur's last day. Now, the dust lay like a soft gray shroud over every surface, and the silence felt heavier than grief. Leo, a man who had spent his life reducing complex structures to clean lines on paper, found the chaos of his father's creative space both comforting and overwhelming. He ran a hand over a half-finished cabinet, the dovetail joints so precise they seemed to have grown that way. Arthur had been a master craftsman, a man who spoke through the grain of wood. Leo, the architect, had inherited the eye for detail, but not the patience for the hands-on work. He had built with steel and glass his father had built with heart, wood and soul. This final task, sorting, clearing, deciding what to keep, felt like a betrayal of that soul. His eyes landed on the humidor sitting on the main workbench. It was a box of polished mahogany, its surface a deep, swirling red-brown, inlaid with a delicate compass rose of maple and walnut. Arthur had made it for him 5 years ago, a gift for his retirement. "So you can finally sit still and enjoy the good things," Head said, his voice a low rumble of affection. Leo didn't smoke cigars, but he kept the box on his desk at home, a testament to his father's love, solid and substantial. Head brought it back to the workshop a week ago, thinking it belonged here, among the tools that gave it life. He picked it up. And paused. Something was wrong. The box was light, unevenly so. He knew its weight, the satisfying heft of dense, aged wood. This felt hollow. A faint rattling from within confirmed it wasn't empty, but the sound was too slight, a tiny skittering that didn't match the memory of the 2 fine cohibas his father had placed inside it years ago. He lifted the lid. The cigars were gone, which was odd but not impossible. Maybe Daniel had helped himself during one of his visits. But the emptiness didn't account for the feeling. Frowning, Leo closed the lid and turned the humidor over in his hands. His architect's gaze, trained to find stress points and structural secrets, scanned the flawless construction. The joints were perfect, the finish like glass. Yet, as he ran his thumb along the bottom edge, he felt that a seam so fine it was almost imperceptible, a hairline crack that ran parallel to the grain but didn't belong to it. It wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. His heart began a low, heavy drum against his ribs. This was his father's work. There were no accidents. With methodical precision, he pressed gently on one corner of the base, then another. On the third press, a section of the bottom panel clicked inward with a soft, oiled sound. A false bottom. Leo slid the panel away, revealing a shallow, felt-lined cavity. It wasn't a sentimental keepsake nestled inside, not an old photograph or a pocket knife. It was the first cold, hard piece of a puzzle he never knew existed. Lying on the soft, dark felt were 2 objects: a folded piece of paper and a key. The key was unlike any modern lock would accept. It was skeleton style, cast from brass that had dulled to a deep bronze, its bow an intricate lattice of what looked like interwoven tree branches. The bit was complex, a series of precise, rectangular wards that spoke of a custom-made lock. It was a craftsman's key, an object with purpose and history. Leo picked up the note. The paper was thin and crisp, a piece of vellum torn from one of his father's old architectural drafting pads. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers tracing the faint blue grid lines beneath the writing. The script was Arthur's, a strong, steady hand that used only capital letters, as if every word was being etched into stone rather than written in ink. 5 words. For when the wood rots from the inside. Below them, a second, shorter line. Check the burl. The message landed in a quiet workshop with the force of a physical blow. Grief, which had been a dull, pervasive ache for the past year, sharpened into something cold and analytical. This wasn't a sentimental farewell. It was an instruction, a contingency plan left by a man who anticipated a threat he could no longer face himself. When the wood rots from me inside. The metaphor was so purely Arthur it was like hearing his voice in the dusty air. His father saw the world through the lens of his craft. To him, integrity was like the grain of a good piece of timber, strong, true, and visible to anyone who knew how to look. Rot was the ultimate enemy, a hidden decay that hollowed a thing out, leaving a beautiful but fragile shell that would collapse under the slightest pressure. And Arthur had only ever built one thing with his family Albright sons' fine woodworking. The business was now Daniel's. Leo sank onto his father's stool, the note resting in his palm. He thought of his younger brother, all ambition and slick presentations. Daniel had taken over management 5 years ago when Arthur's health began to fail, promising to modernize the company. There were new suppliers, a sleek new website, and aggressive expansion into commercial contracts, hotels, corporate offices. Leo, content in his own retirement, had seen it as progress, the natural evolution of a new generation taking the reins. But he also remembered the weariness that had crept into his father's eyes during their last few visits. Arthur had dismissed it as old age, but now Leo saw it differently. He recalled a conversation over dinner, just months before his father's heart gave out. Daniel had been excitedly explaining a new, cost-effective laminate veneer. Arthur had just nodded slowly, his calloused hands resting on the table. A thing should be what it is, all the way through, was all he had said, and the subject was dropped. At the time, Leo had thought it was just his father's old-fashioned stubbornness. Now, it felt like a quiet protest. Check the burl. Leo knew the burl. It was a colossal, gnarled mass of redwood, so large it had been brought into the showroom before the final wall was built. For decades it had stood as the company's centerpiece, a monument to the raw, chaotic beauty of nature. Polished to a glassy sheen, its surface was a swirling galaxy of knocks, eyes, and wild grain. Arthur had loved it, calling it the soul of his workshop. He had turned down offers for it that could have funded the business for a year. Daniel, on the other hand, had always hated it. He saw it as a relic, an immovable obstacle occupying valuable retail space. It's a 5-ton paperweight, Dad had argued more than once. The pieces settled into a dreadful alignment in Leo's mind. The warning of internal decay. The key to a secret lock. The directive to look inside the one object that represented his father's steadfast principles, the very object his brother saw only as a liability. The discovery in the humidor was not the end of a mystery, but the beginning of a mandate. His father, a man who built things to last, had constructed one final project. It wasn't made of wood or stone, but of evidence. And he had just handed Leo the key. The Albright Sons showroom was a world away from the workshop's honest clutter. Under Daniel's direction, the space had been stripped of its rustic charm and replaced with the stark geometry of a modern art gallery. Track lighting cast sterile pools of white on polished concrete floors, and a few pieces of furniture on display felt more like exhibits than invitations to sit. Yet, against the far wall, the burrow remained. It was a magnificent, untamed thing, an anchor of organic chaos in a sea of minimalist design. Leo felt a pang of his father's stubbornness and its continued presence, a silent, massive protest against everything his younger brother stood for. He approached it after hours, letting himself in with his old key. The silence in the showroom was different from the workshop, as it was an empty, waiting silence, not a resting one. He ran his hands over the burl's undulating surface, the wood cool and smooth as polished stone under his fingertips. Arthur had spent hundreds of hours sanding and oiling it, not to tame its shape, but to reveal its soul. The complex topography of knots and fissures was a map of a long life, and Leo began to trace it, not with sentiment, but with purpose. An architect learns to read surfaces for what they hide. He searched for a flaw in the perfection, an anomaly in the natural chaos. His fingers explored deep crevices and rounded protrusions, feeling for the clean, hard edge of human intervention. For nearly an hour, he found nothing but the intricate texture of ancient redwood. Then, his thumb brushed against a dark, recessed knot near the base, no larger than a silver dollar. It looked like any other whorl in the wood, but it felt wrong. There was a subtle give to it, a minute shift that didn't belong to solid timber. Pressing harder, he felt the faint outline of a circle. It was a plug, expertly cut and grained to blend into the surrounding wood. Using his fingernail, he pried at the edge. The wooden plug came free, revealing a dark, circular void. Inside, nestled deep within the wood, was the unmistakable shape of a keyhole, its brass face tarnished with age. It was a masterful piece of concealment, a secret his father had hidden in plain sight for years. With a steady hand, Leo inserted the ornate key from the humidor. It slid into the lock with a satisfying weight, the complex wards engaging the tumblers. He turned it. There was no loud click, only a well-oiled, nearly silent click as the mechanism released. For a moment, nothing happened. Leo frowned, tracing the area around the lock. He felt for a seam, a drawer, a door. Finding none, he simply placed his palm flat against the wood next to the keyhole and pushed. A section of the burl, a piece nearly 3 feet square, swung inward with a whisper of movement, revealing a dark, hollowed-out cavity. The interior was lined with cedar, its fresh scent a stark contrast to the showroom's sterile air. Sitting alone inside was a single, thick ledger, bound in dark green leather. Leo lifted it out. It was heavy, substantial. He carried it to a minimalist oak desk, one of Daniel's new designs, and sat down, the heirloom feeling alien in the modern setting. He opened it. The pages were filled with his father's distinctive, all-caps handwriting, the entries laid out in meticulously ruled columns. This was not the chaotic scribble of a personal journal, it was the precise, disciplined record-keeping of a man building a case. The first entry was dated almost exactly 5 years ago, just weeks after Daniel had officially taken the helm of the company. The columns were clearly labeled date, project invoice, reported cost, actual cost, and a final, damning column diversion. Leo's breath caught. He began to read, his eyes scanning down the page. He recognized the project names. The Grandview Hotel renovation, a project Daniel had lauded as his first major success. The official books showed materials and subcontractor costs of nearly $2 million. Arthur's ledger showed the actual costs were closer to $1.5 million. A diversion of almost $500,000 was logged next to a corporate name Leo had never heard of, Apex Holdings. Page after page told the same story. The Sterling Plaza contract. The waterfront condo development. Each was a success story Daniel had celebrated at family dinners, proof of his modern business acumen. And each, in his father's secret ledger, was a vessel for systematic theft. The diversions were funneled to a handful of shell corporations, Apex Holdings, Riverstone Logistics, Pinnacle Ventures, names that sounded solid and important but were likely nothing more than post office boxes. The methodical detail was heartbreaking. Arthur had cross-referenced invoice numbers, noted discrepancies down to the cent, and tracked the flow of his own company's lifeblood as it was siphoned away. The wood was rotting from the inside, and his father had been a silent, helpless witness, documenting the decay with the only tools he had left. Leo closed the ledger, the soft thud of the leather cover echoing in the empty showroom. The weight in his hands was no longer just paper and ink, it was the weight of a terrible, documented truth. Leo spent 2 days with the ledger. He did not storm into his brother's office or make a single phone call. Instead, he did what he had done his entire professional life when faced with a complex problem: he analyzed the structure. He sat at his wide drafting table, the green leather-bound book open under the clean white light of his architect-esque lamp. He cross-referenced dates, made notes in a separate notebook in his own precise, blocky script, and built a timeline. The rage and sorrow that had first seized him in the showroom receded, replaced by a cold, quiet purpose. Emotion was a variable that weakened foundations. This required logic, evidence, and an unassailable professional opinion. He was a silent partner in the business, a fact Daniel often seemed to forget. His father had left him a 20% stake, a legacy he had never intended to touch. Now, it was his point of entry. It gave him the right to ask questions, the right to audit the books. An audit was a clean, dispassionate process. It dealt in numbers, not accusations. The name came to him from a connection made decades ago, a lawyer who had helped him navigate the brutal contracts of a downtown skyscraper project. The lawyer was long retired, but he remembered the name he had given Leo when a contractor had tried to bury costs in fraudulent change orders. If you need someone to find a needle in a haystack of numbers, he said, you call Isabelle Renaud. She can tell you the history of the hay. Isabelle Renaud's office was in an anonymous glass tower, a space as minimalist and precise as she was. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to tolerate no nonsense. There was no art on the walls, only framed certifications. Her desk was a clean plane of dark wood, holding nothing but a monitor, a keyboard, and a single, perfectly aligned notepad. Leo had set the meeting under the pretense of a standard partnership review, an inquiry into the company's financial health before a potential reinvestment. He sat opposite her, the ledger in his briefcase at his feet. Mr. Albright, she began, her voice calm and even. You mentioned on the phone that you have concerns about irregularities in the accounts for Albright's sons. I do, Leo said, his tone matching hers. He was not a grieving son or a betrayed brother in this room. He was a stakeholder. The company's reported growth seems inconsistent with its liquid assets. My father, Arthur, was the founder. Before he passed, he maintained his own private records. He reached down, retrieved the green ledger, and placed it on the desk between them. The solid, old-world object looked like an artifact from another century on her sleek, modern desk. This is his log, Leo stated, not offering any emotional context. It details discrepancies between reported and actual project costs over the past 5 years. I need to know if what's in this book is verifiable through official channels. I need to know if it's real. Isabelle didn't open the ledger immediately. Her sharp gaze remained on Leo, assessing him. She was accustomed to clients driven by anger, jealousy, or greed. She saw none of that in the man before her. He was calm, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He presented his catastrophic family problem as if it were a structural engineering puzzle. This is an unofficial document, she said, a statement of fact, not a dismissal. Its value will depend on what it leads us to. Bank records, wire transfers, incorporation documents. The official paper trail. I understand, Leo replied. The names of several holding companies are listed. Apex Holdings, Riverstone Logistics. I need to know who owns them. I need to know where the money went. Discreetly. Discretion is the foundation of my business, Mr. Albright, she said. She finally pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to a random page. Her eyes scanned the neat, powerful script, her expression unchanging. For a full minute, she read, her focus absolute. Then she closed the book. I'll need a retainer and a letter authorizing me to act on your behalf as a partner in the company. My investigation will be thorough and it will be quiet. You'll have your answers. Leaving her office and stepping into the sterile elevator, Leo felt no relief. He had simply completed the next necessary step in a devastating process. He had compartmentalized his grief and his anger, locking them away to protect the integrity of the investigation. This was no longer about his pain. It was about his father's legacy, about the truth etched in a secret book, and about a rot that he was now professionally and personally obligated to expose. The call came 10 days later. Isabelle Renaud's voice was as crisp and devoid of inflection over the phone as it had been in person. Mr. Albright. I have completed my preliminary analysis. I believe you will want to see the findings in person. There was no suggestion of what she had found, but the formality itself was a kind of warning. Leo was back in her office the next morning. The room was unchanged, a sanctuary of sterile order. Isabel sat behind her desk, a thin file folder placed squarely in front of her. She did not offer pleasantries. Your father's ledger was an impeccable map, she began, opening the folder. It pointed me exactly where to look. I started with the corporate entities you mentioned: Apex, Riverstone, and Pinnacle. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a diagram, a flowchart drawn with the clean precision of a circuit board. A box labeled Albright Sons sat at the top. From it, arrows pointed down to the three shell corporations. These companies exist, legally speaking, Isabel continued, her finger tapping the box for Apex Holdings. They are registered as vendors and material suppliers. They have bank accounts. Over the last 5 years, Albright Sons has paid them approximately $4.7 million for goods and services. The number hung in the air, a figure so large it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Leo remained perfectly still, his face a neutral mask. The problem, Isabel said, is that these companies don't actually do anything. They have no employees, no warehouses, no inventory. They are phantoms. Their sole purpose is to issue invoices and receive payments. She then produced copies of several invoices. Leo recognized the projects. One was for the Grandview Hotel. The invoice from Riverstone Logistics billed Albright Sons for 10,000 square feet of premium, quarter-sawn white oak flooring. I spoke with the project manager at the Grandview, Isabel said coolly. He confirmed the flooring installed was a commercial-grade laminate. The cost difference is over $300,000 on this one invoice alone. Your father's note in his ledger was accurate to the dollar. It was the perfect crime for a business built on trust and reputation. Who would question an invoice for materials on a successful project? Who would cross-reference the wood specified with the wood installed? Only a master craftsman who could spot the difference from a mile away. Only Arthur. The money didn't stay in the shell accounts for long, Isabel went on, pulling out another document. It was a series of bank transfer summaries. From Apex, Riverstone, and Pinnacle, the funds were consolidated and then moved to a single private investment account. She turned the final page toward him. It was the incorporation document for Apex Holdings. It listed a single director and sole shareholder. Leo did not need to read the name, but he did anyway. Daniel Albright. The confirmation settled not with a crash, but with a deep, silent pressure, like the weight of a collapsing building. It was one thing to suspect, to follow the breadcrumbs his father had left. It was another to see the treachery laid out in black and white, verified by an impartial expert. Daniel hadn't just stolen from the company. He had created an elaborate fiction, a network of ghosts designed to methodically gut the business his father had spent a lifetime building. The facade of success, the talk of expansion and modernization, it was all a cover story for a slow, meticulous heist. Leo looked at the documents, at the clinical, irrefutable proof of his brother's betrayal. His mind, trained in structure and form, saw the anatomy of the fraud with perfect clarity. It was a carefully designed system, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. He felt a cold calm settle over him. The time for emotion had passed. Now, there was only the grim architecture of the truth. What is the current state of the company? Leo asked, his voice steady. Insolvent, or very close to it, Isabel replied without hesitation. The cash flow from new projects is being used to cover the operating costs that the embezzled funds should have sustained. He's been robbing Peter to pay Paul for years. It's unsustainable. Without a significant infusion of capital, it will collapse within the next 6 months. Leo nodded slowly, absorbing this final, brutal fact. Daniel hadn't just been bleeding the company. Had been killing it. The numbers on Isabel's reports were abstract, a series of digits that represented a crime of immense scale but felt strangely impersonal. The true, visceral understanding of Daniel's betrayal came not from a spreadsheet, but from a chance encounter in a coffee shop far from the affluent suburbs where both he and his brother lived. Leo was sketching in his notepad, a habit he had never lost, when a familiar, grizzled face appeared at his table. It was Sam Kowalski, a man who had been his father's foreman for 30 years. Sam had been the heart of the workshop, a craftsman whose hands were as knowing as Arthur's. Leo hadn't seen him since the funeral. "Leo. My God, it's been a while," Sam said, his voice a low rumble. He looked older, more tired than Leo remembered. "Sam. It's good to see you. How have you been?" Leo gestured to the empty chair. Sam sat, but he didn't smile. "Been better. Daniel let me go about 6 months back. Said they were restructuring. 40 years I gave that company, and I get pushed out for a kid with a tablet who doesn't know a mortise from a tenon." The cold knot in Leo's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Sam. I didn't know." "Yeah, well, Daniel's doing a lot of things people don't know about," Sam muttered into his coffee cup. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Look, I shouldn't be talking out of school, but your father Arthur was my friend. What's happening there? It's not right." Leo kept his expression impassive, but his focus sharpened. "What's happening, Sam?" "The wood," Sam said, his voice dropping. "It's the wood. Your dad built his name on sourcing the best timber. He'd drive 3 states away for a good stack of black walnut. He knew the sawmills, the families who ran them. It was a relationship, you know. A matter of honor." Leo nodded, picturing his father running a hand over a rough-sawn plank, reading its story. Daniel changed all that. The old suppliers got cut off. New shipments started coming in from these big, faceless importers. Cheaper stuff. Kiln dried too fast so it's brittle. We started getting boards with voids, knocks, inconsistent grain. Stuff your dad would have used for firewood. Sam leaned forward, his eyes filled with a craftsman's indignation. "But the clients are still getting billed for premium grade. The contracts still specify grade A cherry, solid bird's eye maple. But what's going into the bills? It looks right on the surface, with all the veneers and stains Daniel is so fond of, but it's rotten at the core. It's a lie. A beautiful, well-finished lie." This was the detail that broke through Leo's stoic reserve. The shell corporations, the phantom invoices, that was a crime against the business. This was a crime against his father. Arthur Albright's name was synonymous with quality that was more than skin deep. His signature was the integrity of the material, the honesty of the construction. He built things to last for generations, his work a testament to the belief that a thing's true worth was in its substance, not its appearance. Daniel had taken that legacy and hollowed it out. He wasn't just stealing money, he was replacing the very soul of the company with a cheap, brittle substitute. He was building his fortune on a foundation of lies, both financial and physical. The memory of his father's words at dinner, "A thing should be what it is," all the way through, now resonated with painful clarity. It hadn't been a nostalgic comment. It had been a warning. Arthur had seen the rot starting, not just in the ledges, but in the very grain of the wood his son was bringing into his workshop. Leo thanked Sam, his mind whirring. The conversation had provided a new, tangible layer to the investigation. This was evidence you could touch, a fraud you could wrap your knuckles on and hear the hollow truth. It transformed the abstract numbers into a deep, personal sacrilege. Daniel had not only betrayed his father's trust, he had systematically dismantled and sold off his honor, piece by inferior piece. As Isabel's investigation deepened, the flow of information became a steady, grim tide. Each new report added another layer of irrefutable detail to the edifice of Daniel's deceit. Leo had requested she trace all expenditures from the shell accounts, assuming it would lead to luxury cars or high-risk investments, the typical trappings of stolen wealth. What she found was far more methodical and infinitely more disturbing. She called him for an unscheduled meeting. Her voice on the phone held a new, almost imperceptible tension. "There is one last item, Leo," she said, using his first name for the first time. "I think you need to come in." The file she presented to him was thinner than the others, containing only a few documents. At the top was a copy of a life insurance application. The policyholder was Arthur Albright. The coverage amount was $2 million. Leo stared at the sum, a cold dread coiling in his gut. His father had always been fiscally conservative, a man who believed in living within his means. He had a modest policy to cover funeral expenses, but this was something else entirely. This was a windfall. He looked at the date the policy was enacted 18 months ago. Just 6 weeks before his father, a man with no prior history of heart trouble, had collapsed in his workshop from a massive coronary. His eyes scanned down the form to the section for beneficiaries. There was only one name listed. Daniel Albright. "The application is legitimate," Isabel said, her voice a low, clinical murmur. "The signature appears to be your father's." A medical exam was conducted. He was in good health for a man his age. Leo felt a wave of nausea. He pictured Daniel, his slick, persuasive brother, sitting with their father, framing this policy as a prudent business decision, a way to protect the company in the event of his death. An asset. He could hear the smooth, reasonable tone Daniel would have used, the way he could make the most self-serving action sound like a brilliant strategy. "And the premiums?" Leo asked, his own voice sounding distant, detached. Isabel slid the second document across the desk. It was a bank statement for Apex Holdings, the primary shell corporation. It showed a series of monthly debits, each for the exact amount of the policy's premium. The payments had started the day the policy was enacted and stopped the month after Arthur died. The room fell silent. The air grew thick and heavy. This transcended fraud. Embezzlement was a crime of greed, a betrayal of trust. This was different. This was the cold, patient calculus of a predator. Daniel hadn't just been stealing from the company, he had been placing a bet. A $2 million wager on his own father's death. The connection was circumstantial, of course. Arthur's death had been ruled natural. But seen through the lens of everything else, the meticulous fraud, the replacement of quality with cheap substitutes, the slow, deliberate bleeding of their father's life's work, this final piece of the puzzle cast a sickening pall over the entire picture. It transformed Daniel's actions from a desperate grab for wealth into something monstrous. It suggested that Daniel hadn't just been waiting for his father to die, he had invested in it. Leo thought back to the funeral. Daniel's eulogy had been a masterclass in performative grief. He had spoken of Arthur's strength, his integrity, the legacy he had left them. At the time, Leo had seen it as a son's genuine tribute. Now, he saw it as a victory speech. He slowly closed the file, his movements deliberate, controlled. The architect in him saw the final, crucial support beam of the case slot into place. The cold anger he had suppressed for weeks solidified into something harder, more resolute. This was no longer just about protecting a legacy or recovering stolen money. His father hadn't just been documenting a crime, he'd been documenting the motive for his own potential demise. The humidor, the key, the ledger, they were not just a gift of evidence. They were a dead man's cry for justice. Leo extended the invitation by phone, his tone deliberately casual. "Daniel. It's been a while. I'm at the old house, sorting through some of Dad's things. I was thinking of making his pot roast tonight. You should come over. For old time's sake." There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line, a flicker of suspicion perhaps, before Daniel's practiced charm smoothed it over. "Leo. Great to hear from you." "Yeah, that sounds nice. I've been buried at work. A pot roast sounds perfect. See you at 7. The house itself was a weapon. Every photograph on the mantel, every scuff on the hardwood floor, every book on the shelves was a testament to a life Daniel had systematically betrayed. Leo prepared the meal with methodical care, the familiar motions of chopping carrots and searing the beef a strange comfort. He was not setting a trap, he was building a context, creating a space where the truth would have its own specific gravity. Daniel arrived precisely at 7, dressed in a tailored blazer and carrying a bottle of expensive wine. He was all polished surfaces, from his shoes to his smile. "Place looks good, Leo." "A bit dusty, maybe," he said, glancing around the familiar living room as if it were a museum. "It feels the same," Leo said quietly, taking the wine. "Dad's still here, in a way." They ate at the heavy oak dining table their father had built with his own hands 60 years ago. For a while, the conversation was light, a careful dance around the edges of their lives. Daniel spoke of new contracts, of market expansion, painting a picture of relentless success. He spoke in the abstract language of business, synergy, growth, leveraging assets, a vocabulary that felt alien in that room. Leo listened patiently, a quiet observer. He then steered the conversation gently, like a hand on a rudder. "I was talking to Sam Kowalski the other day," he said, his voice neutral as he cut a piece of meat. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. A flicker of something, annoyance, caution, crossed his face before being replaced by a mask of mild concern. "Oh, yeah. How's old Sam doing? It was a shame we had to let him go. Just wasn't keeping up with the new systems." "He mentioned the new suppliers you're using," Leo continued, not looking up. "He seemed to think the quality of the timber isn't what it used to be. Said Dad would never have approved." Daniel gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Sam's a great craftsman, but he's old school. He doesn't understand modern supply chains, cost efficiency. We guarantee a premium finish, and that's what the client sees. What's underneath is just structure. Dad was a purist, but you can't run a modern business on sentimentality, Leo. You, of all people, should understand that." He gestured with his wine glass, as if appealing to Leo's own pragmatic profession. "Dad believed the structure was the most important part," Leo replied, his gaze finally meeting his brother's across the table. "He used to say that a lie in the framing will always, eventually, show up on the surface." A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the scrape of silverware on china. Daniel's smile tightened at the edges. He took a long sip of wine, his composure beginning to look like a conscious effort. "Speaking of finances," Leo said, shifting his line of inquiry, "I was looking over some of the old partnership documents. Dad had a life insurance policy I never knew about. A big one." This time, Daniel's mask slipped completely. His eyes went cold, his posture stiffening. That was a standard key man policy. Financial prudence. To protect the company's assets in case the principal dies. It's business 101. Was it? Leo asked, his voice still maddeningly calm. Because the premiums were being paid by a company I'd never heard of. Apex Holdings. Do you know them? Daniel placed his fork down with a sharp click. The pretense of a friendly family dinner evaporated, leaving a raw, hostile tension in its place. "You've been digging around, haven't you?" "What is this, Leo?" "An interrogation." "It's a question," Leo said. "A simple question between partners. After all, I still own 20% of the company Dad left us. I think I have a right to understand its finances." Daniel's confidence was fraying, his smooth facade cracking to reveal the raw anger beneath. He had walked into what he thought was a nostalgic evening and found himself in a courtroom of memory, with his calm, methodical older brother acting as prosecutor. He was being cornered, not by accusations, but by quiet, undeniable facts, each one a brick in the wall closing in around him. "An interrogation?" Leo echoed softly, his voice a stark contrast to the rising fury in his brother's eyes. "No. I told you. I'm just sorting through Dad's things. He left a lot behind. With a slow, deliberate movement, Leo stood and walked to the sideboard, an old mahogany piece their father had made as a wedding gift for their mother. He retrieved the green leather ledger and returned to the table. He did not slam it down or present it with a flourish. He simply placed it on the polished oak surface, its weight making a soft, solid sound that seemed to absorb all other noise in the room. He opened the book. The pages were filled with their father's study, indelible script. Leo turned the pages until he found the one he was looking for, the entry for the Grandview Hotel project. He angled the book so Daniel could see it clearly under the warm light of the dining room chandelier. The columns were stark and unambiguous. Reported cost $1,985,000. Actual cost $1,520,000. Diversion $465,000. And beside it, the name Apex Holdings. Leo said nothing. He didn't need to. The ledger was the third person in the room, a silent, unimpeachable witness. It was their father's meticulous care, his discipline, his quiet observation, all bound in leather. It was the carpenter's ghost, laying out the blueprints of his own son's betrayal. Daniel stared at the open page. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, pale shade. The confident businessman vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. His eyes darted from the handwritten numbers to Leo's unreadable face and back again. The calm, rational deflections he had used his entire life were useless against this. This wasn't an accusation he could spin, it was a record. "What is that?" he finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. "What is that supposed to be? Some fantasy notebook?" The old man was losing his mind at the end. Everyone knew it. The lie was weak, pathetic. It hung in the air, a desperate, flimsy thing. Leo remained silent, letting his brother's words curdle in the quiet room. He knew that any denial, any attempt to discredit their father, would only be an admission of guilt. Daniel's panic began to curdle into rage. He pushed his chair back violently, the legs screeching against the wood floor. "You're doing this? You're siding with the ramblings of a dying man over your own brother?" He was jealous. He was a dinosaur who couldn't stand that I was making this company more successful than he ever did. He gestured wildly at the ledger. "Those are just numbers. Doodles. You have no idea what it takes to run a business in the real world. The deals you have to make, the corners you have to cut." He sat in his dusty workshop his whole life while I was out there building an empire. The outburst was a confession, a torrent of self-justification that laid his motives bare. It was about more than money. It was about ego, about a deep-seated resentment of the father whose shadow he could never escape. Leo finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with a sorrow that transcended anger. He knew, Daniel. He saw the rot. He just didn't know how to stop it. So he did the only thing he could. He wrote it all down. He trusted that someone would eventually look. The truth, delivered so calmly, seemed to strike Daniel with physical force. He stared at Leo, his chest heaving, a wild, trapped look in his eyes. The last vestiges of his composure shattered. He was no longer the successful CEO, but a boy caught in a lie too big to escape. Without another word, he turned and fled, leaving his half-eaten meal on the table. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house, leaving Leo alone with the open ledger and the ghost of the man who wrote it. The silence that followed the slam of the door was profound. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but the heavy, ringing silence that follows a great and terrible noise. Leo didn't move from the dining table for a long time. He simply stared at the evidence of his family's ruin, a half-eaten meal, an overturned chair, and the green leather ledger, still open to the page that had broken his brother. Slowly, methodically, he began to clear the table. He scraped the plates, rinsed them, and placed them in the dishwasher, his movements precise and automatic. It was a mundane act of order in the face of profound chaos. He then walked into the living room and lowered himself into his father's armchair. The worn leather groaned, conforming to his shape as it had to Arthur's for 40 years. The indentation in the headrest felt like a phantom presence. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the room. He felt the full weight of his father's final gift. It was not a gift of vengeance, he understood now. Vengeance is a fire, hot and chaotic. This was a blueprint, a meticulously drafted plan for a structure that needed to be built. That structure was justice. This was not a choice between his father and his brother. His father was gone. His brother, the one he had grown up with, had been gone for years, replaced by the stranger who had just fled his house. This was a choice between allowing a crime to fester and seeing it brought into the light. It was about honoring the integrity his father had lived by, an integrity that demanded accountability. To do nothing would be the final, ultimate betrayal. He pulled out his phone. The contact was old, someone he hadn't spoken to in years but whose number he had kept for reasons he hadn't fully understood until now. Detective Frank Miller. Miller was a man like his father, quiet, methodical, and possessing an unshakable belief that things should be what they claimed to be. They had worked together on a civic committee for a new library years ago, and Leo had been struck by the detective's patient, structural approach to problems. The call was brief. "Frank, it's Leo Albright. I know it's late. I need to talk to you about a private matter. A financial matter that has become something more." The next day, Leo sat in a small, sterile interview room at the police station. It was a world away from Isabel Renaud's pristine office, smelling of stale coffee and bureaucracy. On the table between him and Detective Miller, he laid out the pieces of his case with the precision of an architect presenting a final design. First, he placed down his father's ledger. "This is my father's private log," he explained, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "It documents 5 years of discrepancies between reported and actual project costs of my family's business." Next, he laid out Isabel's folder. "This is a report from a forensic accountant I hired. It verifies the numbers in the ledger. It traces approximately $4.7 million from the company to a series of shell corporations." He pointed to the flowchart. "And it shows that the sole director of those corporations is my brother, Daniel Albright." Finally, he placed the last, thinnest file on the table. The insurance policy. "This policy for $2 million was taken out on my father's life 6 weeks before he died of a heart attack. Daniel is the sole beneficiary. The premiums were paid for by one of the fraudulent accounts. He did not offer opinions or accusations. He did not speak of betrayal or grief. He presented the facts, the structure of the crime, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. He was simply the executor of his father's last, terrible project." Miller listened without interruption, his gaze moving from the documents to Leo's face. He picked up the ledger, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned the pages, reading Arthur's strong, clear script. He examined Isabel's report, his expression unreadable. When he got to the insurance policy, he paused, reading it over twice. Finally, he closed the last file and looked at Leo, his eyes holding a deep, weary understanding. "This is a comprehensive and disturbing picture, Leo. You understand what you're doing? There is no coming back from this." "I understand," Leo said, his voice unwavering. "My father built his company, and his life, on the principle of integrity. I am here to honor that. It was a necessary call. A necessary act. It was the only way to stop the rot, to cut it out completely, even if it meant severing a part of himself. It was not revenge. It was a quiet, heartbreaking reckoning." The news broke not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of the internet. A sterile headline on a local business journal's website: "Albright's son CEO arrested in embezzlement scandal." Daniel's photo was there, a professionally shot headshot where he looked confident and visionary. The article was sparse on details but heavy on implication, speaking of a complex fraud scheme and a family legacy in jeopardy. The phones at Leo's house, silent for a year, began to ring with calls from distant relatives and forgotten family friends, their voices a mixture of shock, pity, and a morbid, veiled curiosity. Leo answered none of them. He went to the showroom first. The bank had already put a lien on the property. The minimalist furniture, once symbols of Daniel's modern vision, now looked cheap and abandoned under the harsh fluorescent lights. And there, against the far wall, stood the burl. It seemed to absorb the room's despair, its ancient, gnarled surface a silent witness to the rise and fall of the family name. Leo ran a hand over it, the wood feeling colder than he remembered. The true devastation was in the workshop. The creditors had seized everything of quantifiable value. The big machines, the planer, the table saw, the industrial sander, were gone, leaving ghostly outlines in the sawdust on the floor. Only his father's old hand tools remained, left in her wooden chests because their value was sentimental, not monetary. The soul of the place had been auctioned off, and what was left was an empty, echoing shell. Albright's son's fine woodworking was, for all intents and purposes, dead. In the weeks that followed, the full picture emerged. The company was bankrupt, saddled with debts from phantom projects and liabilities from contracts fulfilled with substandard materials. The Albright name, once a regional hallmark of quality, was now a synonym for fraud. Leo could have walked away. He was retired, his own finances secure. He could have let the company dissolve into a footnote in a bankruptcy court filing. But walking away would have meant letting Daniel have the last word. It would have meant the lie would outlive the truth. He sat down with Isabel Renault one last time, not as a client, but as a man facing a ruin. He laid out his own financial statements on her immaculate desk. "I want to save the company," he said. "Not the business, maybe, but the name. The legacy. It will consume your retirement, Leo," she warned, her professional guard softened by a flicker of genuine concern. "The debts are immense. The reputational damage is catastrophic." "It's not about profit," he replied. "It's about making things right." And so Leo, the architect who had spent his life designing structures of steel and glass, began the slow, arduous task of rebuilding one maid of honor. He used his own money to settle the most immediate debts, prioritizing the small suppliers and craftsmen his father had worked with for decades, the ones Daniel had cheated. He called every client who had received inferior work and promised to make it right, at his own expense. He hired Sam Kowalski back, not as a foreman, but as a partner. Together, the two old men began to work out of the hollowed-out workshop. They didn't take on massive commercial contracts. They started small, with a single commission, a handcrafted dining table for a family who had been a client of Arthur's 50 years ago. Leo drew the plans, his lines as clean and precise as ever. Sam selected the wood, his hands reading the grain with an old, familiar wisdom. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the county jail. It was from Daniel. Leo read it standing by his father's old workbench. It was not a letter of apology or remorse. It was a tirade of blame, a self-pitying screed that painted Daniel as the victim of their father's antiquated ideas, of Leo's jealousy, of a world that didn't appreciate his genius. There was no accountability, no recognition of the lives he had ruined or the trust he had shattered. He had learned nothing. Leo folded the letter and placed it in a cold pot-bellied stove in the corner of the workshop. He did not set it on fire. He just left it there, a final, dead piece of a past he had to cut away. The hollow space where a brother used to be ached with a phantom pain, but it was a clean wound now, no longer poisoned by deceit. He picked up one of his father's old hand planes. The steel was cool, the wooden handle worn smooth and dark from a lifetime of use. He set it to a plank of cherry wood, and with a long, steady motion, shaved off a perfect, paper-thin curl. The scent of the wood filled the air, clean and honest. This was his inheritance. Not the money, not the company, not the house. It was this, the burden of the truth, the weight of a name that had to be rebuilt from ash, the duty to a legacy of integrity. The victory was real, Justice had been served, the rot had been exposed. But it was a painful, hollow victory that had cost him the last of his family. He was the sole remaining guardian of the Albright name, alone in the quiet workshop, making things right, one honest shaving at a time. In the end, the silence in Arthur's workshop wasn't just filled with the scent of wood shavings, but with the profound weight of a legacy restored. The story started with a father's final gift, but we learned that the true inheritance was the terrible burden of seeing the truth through to the end. It's a powerful reminder that integrity, like the grain in a piece of timber, is something that must run all the way through, even when it means cutting away the parts that are rotten. Thank you for being part of this story with us here at Content Channel. It raises such difficult questions about where our loyalties should lie. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. When Leo was sitting at that dinner table, do you think there was any other way forward, or was the call to the police the only honorable choice he had left? We appreciate you being here and look forward to seeing you for our next story. Stay tuned for a tale where the evidence of betrayal isn't found in a ledger, but in a series of forgotten photographs that force a wife to question if the husband she's mourning was the man she truly knew.